So when you think of the War on Terror, what is the first thing that comes to your mind?
I think the Twin Towers.
I think about the treatment of the subject in the media.
I think the War on Terror was something that started off very promising. It was conceptualized after 9/11 when the world was in shock. And I feel like we should investigate what actually happened carefully, responsibly.
When you think of the War on Terror in pop culture, what is the first thing you think of?
The Hurt Locker? Zero Dark 30.
I think immediately of the TV series NCIS in many of its different forms, because I think they were heavily influenced by the War on Terror in a lot of the way they treated the subject and the subjects they dealt with.
And what do you think of? Is there any specific film or TV show you associate with the War on Terror? Many of you will probably say American Sniper. This film made more money at the box office than every film about the War on Terror that came before combined. More than $500 million. It is the most successful American war film of all time, and yet it's been criticized for being pro-war, or at least for a one-sided portrayal of the War on Terror. And Chris Kyle, the real-life American sniper whose autobiography the film is based upon, is not uncontroversial either. He's been accused of lying in public multiple times, among other things. Today, we are going to take a closer look at the most lethal sniper in American history, the accusations against him, and how the film American Sniper ignored all the problematic parts of Chris Kyle's life. My name is Laura Haggis. I'm a PhD candidate in American Studies, and this is the first episode of my new podcast, War Pop, the War on Terror in Pop Culture. In this podcast, I analyze films, books, TV shows, music, and other pop cultural products about the War on Terror. How do we perceive America's longest war? And how much do different types of media influence our perception? This and more in... This is War Pop, the War on Terror in Pop Culture. This story starts in 1982 in rural Texas. Chris Kyle is 8 years old and his father gifts him his first rifle. Going hunting together is a bonding activity for the father and son duo. The father is a strict man who sometimes beats Chris if he doesn't do what he's supposed to, but in his memoir, Chris still describes him as his best friend who taught him values like the importance of family, self-reliance, and patriotism. Chris Kyle grows up in a Christian household and holds on to his faith all his life. In his book, he ranks his priorities like that: God, country, family. Although he says it's a close race between country and family. Growing up, Chris also develops a strong sense of justice. He protects his brother and some other kids from the bullies at school. In the book, he writes that he sees the world in black and white. There is good and there is evil, with not much in between. This will be mirrored when he talks about his experiences in Iraq later. The film adds an interesting sequence to this, in which his father explains to Chris that there are only 3 types of people in the world: sheep, wolves, and sheepdogs. It is the duty of the sheepdogs to protect the sheep from the evil wolves. And this is exactly what Chris wants to do. He turns this into his life philosophy. Chris Kyle joins the Navy SEALs when he's 24 years old. The movie, however, makes him a bit older, 30 to be precise. I'll come back to that later. After 9/11, when the United States starts the War on Terror, Chris goes to Iraq to fight together with his platoon. And this is where his religious views become kind of problematic. In his book, he writes, "I had never known that much about Islam. Raised as a Christian, obviously I knew that there had been religious conflicts for centuries. I knew about the Crusades, and I knew that there had been fighting and atrocities forever. But I also knew that Christianity had evolved from the Middle Ages. We don't kill people because they're a different religion. The people we were fighting in Iraq after Saddam's army fled or was defeated were fanatics. They hated us because we weren't Muslim. They hated us, even though we just booted out their dictator, because we practiced a different religion than they did. Isn't religion supposed to teach tolerance? He later also gets a tattoo of a red crusader cross and uses religion as a way to, first of all, distance himself from the Iraqi people, and also to appear superior and to dehumanize them. All of this can be summarized under the term othering. You make somebody appear different from you in order to justify your actions against them. This is also illustrated when Chris Kyle talks about why he went to Iraq. He says that he didn't risk his life to bring democracy to the country. He risked his life to protect his friends and the American people. I'm going to quote him here. "I went to war for my country, not Iraq. My country sent me out there so that bullshit wouldn't make its way back to our shores. I never once fought for the Iraqis. I could give a flying fuck about them." Kyle goes to Iraq 4 times. Some of his friends lose their lives while in combat. Therefore, he hates the people he fights against, who he, at that point in the story, calls savages. For this episode, I wanted to talk to an expert about soldier autobiographies. I therefore decided to invite Dr. Deborah de Jong, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Gießen University. She wrote her dissertation about soldier memoirs, and luckily she accepted my invitation. In our interview, I asked her about othering specifically. So now I have a very special guest, my first guest on this podcast ever,
Woo-hoo!
Dr. Deborah de Jong. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here. So, Deborah, you are a postdoc and an academic coordinator at the International Graduate Center for the Study of Culture at the University of Gießen. And you completed your PhD in 2022 at the Institute of English Literature at RWTH Aachen University. And the name of your thesis, of your doctoral thesis, is Cultural Models of Narrative Identity, the Case of Military Autobiographical Writing.
Very long, yes.
As it is usually the case with a doctoral thesis. So in this thesis, you examine how British soldiers and veterans reconstruct their identities after war experiences through autobiographical storytelling. You wrote about an us and them dichotomy as well. With the military being us and the enemy is then them. Yeah. And I actually want to quote one of the memoirs that you talked about by Peter de la Billière, who's also an Iraq veteran. And he said, "The hell on earth that the Iraqis had created by their cruelty and wanton destruction with the 10th century or worse methods." So that is kind of very similar to how Chris Kyle writes about Iraq. And I wanted to ask, is this type of othering, this type of maybe even dehumanizing, is it present in all wars that were described in the memoirs you analyzed, or is it specific to Iraq?
No, it was done in all of them. All enemies dehumanized, all enemies othered, maximum emotional distance from the other as possible, expressed through language. I would even argue that that's a very important mechanism, not in the sense of that I find it good, but in the sense of I think it's necessary for people who have been to war to do this if they want to keep their mental, sanity is maybe too extreme, but I think there's a reason why all military cultures do it this way. Again, not that I think it's good, but...
Sure. Yeah. And when it comes to things like, things that are considered morally bad, like harming people, killing people, maybe even war crimes. You also talked about several strategies of justification that are applied in these memoirs. Yeah. I'm just going to go through a couple of them because there were many.
Oh, nice. Thank you.
So, for example, emphasizing the moral necessity of one's action. In the case of American Sniper, it's often said, "Oh, I'm saving American lives. I'm saving the lives of my comrades." And in the case of the War on Terror, it was always about saving American civilians, I would also argue. And then you've got emphasizing the positive outcomes of one's actions. And there I actually wondered, are there always positive outcomes? Because if we stay with the Iraq War, that was actually a military disaster. And so I just wondered, how do you make something positive out of it? I mean, as I said, Chris Kyle focuses on like the lives he apparently saved. How do other soldiers or veterans make something positive out of something like the Iraq War?
I mean, first of all, I think we have to say that language is not necessarily always truth, but language is how we form our truth. And so for someone who has been, let's say, in the Iraq War and they realize, oh God, this was unnecessary or not called for, how do you survive that emotionally? How do you deal with that? I think in a way, soldiers and veterans adapt their language to support their own, but also their comrades' emotional survival. The examples that I analyzed, for example, those looking at the positive outcome, they oftentimes, for example, highlighted by killing this group of enemy soldiers, for example, we were able to save this huge group of women and children who randomly stood around the corner or whatever. Generally speaking, you refer to these narrative techniques of neutralization. And I think I would like to highlight that this is a term that originally derived from the field of narrative criminology and sociology. And these are strategies usually used by perpetrators to explain their criminal behavior. And so to give one example that shows that we do this in our everyday life as well, the story of Robin Hood, for example, he steals, but he steals from the rich and he gives to the poor. So there's not really a crime happening. And that really shapes the way that we see Robin Hood. And soldiers and veterans, they do the same. At the same time, I have to say that not all of them all the time use these strategies to shift their perception of the reality. Many of them did expressly say, I don't know what we did there. I don't know why we were sent here. I don't think it's correct. And I understand that the enemy did not want us there. And I think it's important to highlight that not all of them necessarily used these strategies to make reality be more bearable for them. But many of them also are very, very brave and face reality and say, I think this was wrong. I think this was a mistake.
Chris Kyle and his platoon do something quite similar. They paint the logo of the Marvel superhero The Punisher on their tanks to show that they are the good guys who are here to punish all the evil people. It seems like their version of Robin Hood. He also uses other techniques to justify his actions. Yeah, so then another strategy was narratively highlighting external recognition. That's also very present in American Sniper, because Chris Kyle received several medals for these 160 confirmed kills. Then another one was denial of responsibility by saying that a third party was responsible or the circumstances were responsible. And the one that I actually found the most interesting was the distortion of facts. This is something that I found incredibly harmful in American Sniper, actually, because there is one part in the book when Kyle talks about weapons of mass destruction. And we all know at this point that Iraq did not possess weapons of mass destruction. And then what he says is that the media got this term wrong because they assumed that weapons of mass destruction would mean atomic bombs, but they had other weapons, and you could interpret these other weapons as weapons of mass destruction. And so it kind of reminded me of what you described as nuancing the facts, like there are no hard facts. And I wondered, when you read all these autobiographies, or like generally for us, for me and for the listeners, when you read autobiographies of soldiers, how much can you actually believe? Do you always have to take everything with a grain of salt and be aware that, okay, maybe some things are just invented, maybe some things are not true or like misrepresented?
Oh, that's a brilliant question.
Thank you.
I have to say, I did take many of these narratives with a grain of salt for several reasons. And I did have to do quite a bit of sort of historical / political background research to make sure that their description of reality is aligned with the description of reality that we have agreed on in, let's say, history books. Then again, we could also argue, obviously, that history books are also not always aligned with,
Right.
And then there was a second reason that made me sometimes question the truth that was being presented. I would say of the 30 books that I originally worked with 31 books. And 30 of those, I would argue, were written by people with all different types of backgrounds, all different types of traumas, social, educational backgrounds. But all of them, I would argue, were healthy in the sense that they were willing to take accountability for what they were doing. And they were using some strategies to make, life easier for them or to make them look more heroic, but they did it with accountability. There was, however, one book, and I'm not going to mention the author's name, and also decided not to keep him in the corpus, but I worked with him, or not with him as a person, but with his book for a long time. And I wholeheartedly believe that that person was a psychopath. I studied psychology in my bachelor's. I'm not a therapist, so I'm not allowed to officially declare someone ill or not ill, but I am used to looking at the ICD or the DSM-5, and I know how to use classifications. And that person, he genuinely enjoyed killing people, and he did not lie about it. But that level of personality disorder automatically is going to make that person perceive themselves in the world in a very different light than everyone else. And so that was that one unique case where I decided to completely leave the narrative out because there was going to be too much untruth hidden in the pages.
After his fourth time in Iraq, Kyle has shot 160 people, making him the most lethal sniper in American history. He comes home as a war hero, and his book, American Sniper, which comes out in 2012, becomes a bestseller. However, he also suffers from PTSD, which is briefly described in the book, and much more so in the film. And he becomes the founder of an organization that helps traumatized veterans, which, tragically, is his death sentence. When he takes a traumatized ex-Marine to a shooting range for a sort of therapeutic session, the man shoots Kyle, who passes away. We could discuss now about his decision to give a pistol to a traumatized soldier, but what's more interesting is how famous Chris Kyle becomes, especially after his death. 7,000 people attend his funeral. There is a televised memorial service at the Dallas Cowboys Stadium. From the stadium, Kyle's casket is driven 200 miles to a cemetery south of Dallas. Thousands of spectators line the highway, honoring him by waving American flags. A second book, American Gun, is published posthumously in 2013, and his wife's book, American Wife, is published in 2015. But let's go back to the first book for a moment. American Sniper, which came out 1 year before Kyle's death, was at the top of the New York Times bestseller list, and it sold 1.2 million copies in 2012 and 2013 alone. I wanted to talk to Deborah about the structure of the book. You sorted all the autobiographies you read into 5, and I love this word, kumonies.
Oh, thank you.
So that means cultural models of narrative identity.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to try and summarize those 5 different types. So you've got the peace-enforcing veteran. Mm-hmm. He has a high level of identification with the army, but he makes individual peace-enforcing decisions. Mm-hmm. He represents himself as a spokesperson of the army, and he shares little personal detail. Mm-hmm. Then the second one is the commanding soldier at heart. He also has a high level of identification with the army. And he shares some more details of his life story. The plot focuses on camaraderie and adventure, but also on some combat-related trauma. The third one is The Adventurous Soldier at Heart. The plot focuses on his physical and mental development in an adrenaline-driven narrative. He also has a high identification with the military, but there is little space for individual failure or trauma. And then we've got The Value-Driven Adventurer. This is more focused on individuality, so he's more independent from the culture of the military. And the book focuses on his professional, physical, and emotional development, but it also addresses trauma and shows a journey to growth. And then the last one, and I think you said that is the one that's most different from the others, is The Traumatized Individual.
Yeah.
So this is the most individuality-based model. It is, in many cases, not chronological, and it focuses on traumatic experiences, but also on finding meaning and purpose in the pain and on a journey to growth. Was that a good summary?
That was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
No, I didn't have to do it.
When I read this, I was wondering, can every memoir really be sorted into one clear model, or are there also memoirs that fit more than one of them?
Yeah, that's actually a question I was even asked in my defense. And I have to say, in all honesty, no. I would say that there's a fluid transition here from one model to the next. However, in my dissertation and then also in the forthcoming monograph, I have one or two sort of most ideal prototypes per model. So the books that I chose for my close readings as sort of the main examples for each model are the ones that follow these models the strictest. And then there's sort of fluctuation and fluid movement in between them. But generally speaking, I would argue, and I wouldn't say that I'm happy about this, because I don't think it's always necessarily the healthiest for storytellers. But these models are really quite fixed, and I don't think that if you apply one model to your life story, you're always going to stick to this one. Obviously, there's going to be changes in there as well, but they are. I mean, I spent a lot of time reading these books, and at the end of it, because they were 30, I was sitting on my living room floor, and I had this massive pile of books surrounding me. And I think there were only 3 or 4 cases where I was not really sure in which box to fit this particular book, because most of them quite nicely fit into one of these categories, with sort of minor things sort of fluctuating and tending more toward the one model or the other.
That is super interesting. And actually, I read your dissertation before I read American Sniper. And so when I read your dissertation, I kind of assumed that Chris Kyle, the protagonist of American Sniper, has to be the traumatized individual, because I knew that he had PTSD. But only because you have PTSD doesn't mean that you are the traumatized individual. And in fact, he's not, right? Yeah. And then I think, or actually I'm quite convinced, that Kyle is actually the commanding soldier at heart.
Interesting. Can you tell me why you think so?
Definitely, yeah. I wrote down some reasons from your dissertation that I used to justify that. So you said that this model is based on the sharing of active combat experience, and that the protagonist feels exhilarated and truly alive every time he finds himself in a war zone. That happens very much in American Sniper. And then also the fact that the army is regarded as consisting of the strongest relationships among comrades, to the point where the protagonist finds it unbearable to be separated from them. And literally every time he's at home, so he went to Iraq 4 times, and every time he's at home, he's like, oh, I should actually be in Iraq right now. I should be fighting with my comrades. And he always feels kind of bad being with his family instead of with the comrades. And what I found really fascinating is when you pointed out the basic structure of the plot of The Commanding Soldier at Heart, because it corresponds exactly to American Sniper, the book and the film as well.
Oh, does it? Oh, that's nice to hear.
I'm just gonna go through it. So it starts out with a prologue or a foreword, and then the first point of the plot is diving into battle. And then really in the book and in the film, the first scene you see is that there is a woman with a child and a grenade, and he has to shoot this woman, basically.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a big moment. It's kind of a bit like a foreshadowing, because you only see later in the film what actually happens, that he actually shoots her. So this is like the first thing we actually see. And then, just as you describe in your structure, it goes back to his childhood. And then you see his father raising him with, Christian and arguably quite conservative values. And then the next point is early adolescence and military education. Happens exactly like that in American Sniper 2. Then special education program and training when he joins the Navy SEALs. Then meeting one's future wife and having children. The wife also plays a big role in the memoir. She's called Taya. And the meeting is described in quite a bit of detail there. Then the first battle experiences, when he goes to Iraq for the first time. Then the main battle, which is probably his following tours to Iraq. Relationship issues due to one's profession, that is also described. As I said, he does experience PTSD. It is a bit more detailed in the film than in the book, but he also mentions in the book. And at some point, they also have relationship issues because he is in touch again with his ex-girlfriend, and they text, and then he has an argument with his wife about it. But they no. But then they kind of make it through anyway. And then it ends with returning home and an epilogue, and it's exactly the same structure. And I found this so fascinating. And then I wondered, how is it possible that so many books that fit into the same category all follow the same structure? And I thought of several reasons for that. So I thought maybe it's because of the ghostwriters, because they know what the audience wants and kind of expects to read, and maybe they shape the narrative in that way. Or then I thought maybe if you are a veteran and you know, okay, I want to write an autobiography, maybe subconsciously you think of other autobiographical films or books, and you're like, okay, I liked that one and it had this structure, and then maybe you take this as an inspiration. So what do you think of that? Do you have other theories?
I really like what you've just said. And I wholeheartedly agree with you. So on the one hand, I'm not always sure if it's necessarily going to be the ghostwriters, but generally speaking, we have certain genre conventions, whether it's a military memoir or a romantic novel or whatever it might be. We have conventions which both publishers want writers to adhere to, but then also audiences kind of want this. But generally speaking, no one can write their autobiography or memoir and expect it to just be published like it is. But publishing houses will always go back and forth with them, and they have certain ideas and ideals of structure, of length, of time. And what I particularly liked about what you just said is that other books and other stories significantly influence the way that we structure our self-perception, how we position ourselves in our culture. There's something that in literature and in cultural studies and also in psychology we've referred to as so-called turning points. Turning points are culturally pre-established notions of things that we expect to be outstanding, but at the same time expected of us. So, for example, most people, whether they have attended the military or not, when they share their life story, they will, and even when they think about writing an autobiography, they will include elements such as their childhood friends. If you are heterosexual or heteronormative, at least, you will include your first love, which that's why I'm mentioning the heteronormative part. For heterosexual people, it's usually in their early teenage years. For queer people, it's often a little bit later because of culture expecting slightly different behavior from them than they display. It usually also includes getting married, having children, if that's something that you decide to do. And every culture and subculture has its own little set of turning points. And it's the same thing for military personnel. If you serve in the military, you are surrounded by the stories that your comrades share with you face to face, but also by the stories about other heroes that you look up to. Like, for example, this particular very famous sniper who I think everyone in the United States is aware of, whether they are military personnel or not. So members of a culture are always surrounded by the stories that they hear, whether it's face-to-face conversations with their comrades or it's heroes that they look up to. And these little subcultures, they have their own turning points as well. So, for example, if you are a member of the Special Air Services, then this really extremely heavy training is always going to be part of your life story. If you are part of a culture or subculture where most of the times, unfortunately, because of your profession, your romantic relationships are going to fail, which was the case for, I would say, 85% of the books that I looked at.
So sad.
It's so sad. And but that's then automatically going to be part of your story as well, because it's something that you learn, but it's also something that's expected from you. And by repeating these turning points, you affirm cultural belonging. We remember culturally pre-established plots that have these culturally expected turning points. And then what we do with these slots is we fill them with our own little islands of individuality. And then it becomes our life story. But it's never just our life story. It's always our life story in the framing of the culture where we have learned to tell stories and to listen to stories as well. I forgot what your original question was, but I feel like I kind of answered the question.
Yeah, you did. I was also thinking, if you go to war and you probably see horrible things and horrible things happen to you and to your friends, it's probably also a way to like make meaning of all of it, to put this into these frames.
That's a very important point, and at the same time, it's one that's very, very difficult. And I think that the books that I've worked with very brilliantly display this, because on the one hand, when people have experienced trauma and they suffer from PTSD, they're encouraged to verbalize their traumatizing experiences in a therapeutic session. And then they learn to integrate the trauma into their life story, make meaning from it, and then that's a way of healing. But if the trauma is something that forces you to integrate an experience into your identity that you actually don't want to have there, like, for example, having unfortunately killed this woman with her child in her arms, that is an incredibly, incredibly difficult thing to even just pronounce in front of other people, let alone then write that story down for a large audience to read and to engage with. And so military personnel have a significantly harder time to, first of all, find a therapist who supports them, because the British military has not always been the most supportive environment, but then also find a therapist where they feel comfortable enough to verbalize everything that they have gone through.
The book, as I already hinted at, was quite controversial from the start. Some critics called Chris Kyle a hero, while others called him a serial killer. Now, I asked myself, why was this book such a huge success? Well, the timing might have played a role. It came out less than a year after a group of Navy SEALs killed Osama bin Laden and thus brought public attention to the SEALs. After his book was published, Chris Kyle became a celebrity and, fun fact, he took part at a reality TV show called Stars Earn Stripes, in which celebrities had to compete in several challenges based on training exercises of the US Army. It only ran for one season, though, and the only celebrity contestant I know is Nick Lachey, who is Jessica Simpson's ex-husband. And that's literally all I know about him. But as I already mentioned, Kyle was a controversial person. Jesse Ventura, a Navy veteran, former professional wrestler, and governor of Minnesota, successfully sued Kyle for defamation based on a passage in American Sniper. This passage is no longer included in more recent editions, but it described Kyle punching someone he later identified as Ventura for speaking disrespectfully of the SEALs. This never happened. In 2016, The Intercept published a story alleging that Kyle had exaggerated his medal counts, leading the Navy to revise his official record. And maybe he alludes to this in his autobiography, because he writes at the very beginning of it, "One week it's 160, then it's way higher, then it's somewhere in between. If you want a number, ask the Navy. You may even get the truth if you catch them on the right day." Sounds a bit passive-aggressive to me. Journalists also raised some serious doubts about the accuracy of other stories that Kyle had told, such as the claim that in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, he and a friend went to New Orleans and killed 30 criminals, and that in 2009, shortly after he retired from the SEALs, he shot 2 men dead who tried to steal his truck. And then something happened. Bradley Cooper purchased the film rights to the book, and that's when the real hype started. The film American Sniper is the most successful war film of all time. It earned $500 million at the box office, as well as several Oscar nominations. It might have been even more controversial than the book, though. Many critics said that they liked the film because it allowed American audiences to express pride in their defenders and see the domestic struggle that military families endure. Many have called it a pro-war film. Others have called it an anti-war film. What we can definitely say, however, is that it's quite different from the book. As I told Deborah in our interview, I initially thought that Chris Kyle's memoir might fall into the category of the traumatized individual, because PTSD plays such a big role in the film, much more so than in the book. Furthermore, the role of Kyle's antagonist, Mustafa, is expanded in the film. Bradley Cooper even called the film a Western, with a classic duel of 2 sharpshooters between Kyle and Mustafa, like a cowboy standoff. In the book, Mustafa is only mentioned once. What's really bizarre is that the film has a main villain who doesn't exist in the book either. He uses a drill to kill people, and this is completely surreal. Like, why use a rechargeable drill when you can simply use a knife or a rifle? One critic even called it a weapon straight out of an American horror movie, which kind of adds to the othering of the Iraqi people, which is featured heavily in the film. For example, there is one friendly Iraqi man who invites Kyle and his platoon into his house for a meal, sitting down with his wife and children. But it doesn't take Kyle long to discover that this man has a lot of hidden weapons in the house. So all the Iraqis are kind of portrayed as dangerous, and even the friendly ones are treacherous. According to the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, harassment and attacks against Muslims increased because of the film. But what's most interesting to me is how different the film version of Chris Kyle is from the book version. I already mentioned that film Chris is older than book Chris when he joins the Navy, and he's mocked by his instructor for his age. I thought maybe the film producers wanted us to root for an older underdog. Furthermore, the reasons for joining the Navy are completely different. While book Chris does it after quitting college because studying is not his thing, film Chris joins the Navy after he sees news coverage of the 1998 U.S. Embassy bombing, giving his decision more weight. The film also ignores Chris's religious framing of the war in Iraq and his othering, which in the book is expressed with statements like, "I don't shoot people with Qurans, I'd like to, but I don't." It also omits his denial that the US forces had killed civilians and his claims that they were weapons of mass destruction, and the media had just gotten the definition wrong. As I already said, the film also shows PTSD way more than the book. I think this might be in an effort to make Chris Kyle more likable and relatable as a hero, because he's also struggling. But one of the articles I read also suggested that the PTSD makes the film more realistic and thus increases the chances for award nominations, which clearly worked out. And additionally to performing incredibly well at the box office, the film might have also shaped our long-term memory of the war in Iraq. For example, one reviewer who wrote for the conservative newspaper New York Post wrote that the film redeems militarism itself. After 40 years of Hollywood's counter-propaganda telling us that war is necessarily corrupting and malign, American Sniper nobly presents the case for the other side. Michael Rancor, who is a researcher at Portland State University, argues that the film could influence Americans in judging the war, going from a shameful mistake to judging it as an important step in preserving democracy at home and abroad. He also says that while previous Iraq war films called into question the purpose of this war, American Sniper makes it clear that remembering Iraq is about remembering the sacrifice of bold individuals in the struggle against evil. Terence McSweeney, a film studies scholar, even says that American Sniper is part of a conscious effort to reframe the events of the Iraq War and reimagine it. And what about Chris Kyle? He was a controversial person, that's for certain. He protected his comrades, and he tried to help traumatized veterans. He hated the people he was fighting against, and he did not care about Iraqis. He experienced some terrible things, got traumatized, and lost friends in combat. He was caught lying in public. He cared a lot about his wife and family. All of these things can be true at the same time. What matters, however, is that the film takes this very controversial person and turns him into an ideal war hero, which influences how we remember the War on Terror. The film could have been an interesting opportunity to discuss this war, the sacrifices made by American soldiers, and the lie about weapons of mass destruction that started it. But instead, it ignores how controversial the War on Terror is to instead focus on the ideal soldier others can look up to. Time will tell how much this film and others influence our memory of America's longest war. Thank you so much for listening to my first episode of War Pop, the War on Terror in Pop Culture, and a special thank you to Dr. Deborah DeMunk for being my first guest. The interview with her really added to my perspective, and we talked about so many more interesting aspects. If you'd like to learn more about soldier memoirs, PTSD, and how we shape our life writing with the help of so-called cultural models, you can listen to the full interview, which I will upload after this episode. This is War Pop, the War on Terror in Pop Culture.